Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today, December 26th, the day after Christmas, this is our Christmas Sunday school lesson. And thus we are interrupting our study from the Old Testament. We've been studying from Ezekiel. And I'm wearing my Christmas colors, green and red. Today, we're also going to do something that we have not done before. For the last several years, I'm going to explain that. For the last several years, I have read a Christmas parable, which had been delivered by Paul Harvey. It impressed me as a modern day parable of illustrating why Jesus had to come to this earth as our Savior. It's a parable, a Christmas story, a modern day Christmas story told by Paul Harvey. Because of our new technologies and our abilities to do extras, we're going to hear from Paul Harvey himself today. I've asked Jeremy to cue it up, and Jeremy, let's play Paul Harvey's The Man and the Birds.
Americans, may I direct your attention to a story which was originally published by United Press International by Lewis Cassels, a longtime friend of mine and colleague. He and I tried for many years to trace the author of these words. We never could, and it occurs to me that maybe some things are supposed to be written without credit to any particular individual. Let's see what you think after you hear this Christmas story. The Christmas story, the way it's usually told, the God born a man in a manger and all of that, escapes some moderns, mostly I think, because they seek complex answers to their questions, and this one is so utterly simple. So for the cynics and the skeptics and the unconvinced, I'd like to submit this modern parable. The man I'm talking about was not a Scrooge now. He was a kind, a decent, a mostly good man, generous to his family and upright in his dealings with other men, but he just did not believe in all of that incarnation stuff which the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just did not make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He could not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. He told his wife, "I'm truly sorry to distress you, but I'm just not going with you to church this Christmas Eve." He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay home, but that he would wait up for them. So he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Now, shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier. Then he went back to his fireside chair, began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, and then another, then yet another. At first he thought somebody must be throwing snowballs against the living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled out there miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm. In a desperate search for shelter, they had tried to fly through his large landscape window. That was what had been making the sound. Well, he couldn't let those poor creatures just lie there and freeze. So he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter. All he would have to do is direct the birds into that shelter. Quickly, he put on a coat and galoshes, and he tramped through the deepening snow to the barn, and he opened the doors wide. And inside the barn, he turned on a light so the birds would know the way in. But the birds did not come in. So he figured that food would entice them. He went back into the house and fetched some breadcrumbs and sprinkled those on the snow, making a trail of breadcrumbs to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs. The birds just continued to flop around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He could not. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them waving his arms, but instead they scattered in every direction except into the warm lighted barn. And that's when he realized that they were afraid of him. They were afraid of him. To him, he reasoned, I'm a strange, terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them but to help them. But how? Any move he made tended to frighten them and confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. And he thought to himself, if only I could be a bird now, if I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language and tell them not to be afraid, then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them, wouldn't I? So they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind, and he stood there listening to the bells. Adeste Fidelis. Listening to the bells pealing the glad tidings of Christmas, and he sank to his knees in the snow. Paul Harvey, I hope for you and those you love, this will be a wonderfully Merry Christmas.
Thank you to Paul Harvey for delivering us this modern-day Christmas parable. It has always been one of my favorites. And so let's now return with that on our mind to today's lesson, taken from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2. We're looking at, as the New International Version says, the visit of the Magi. And I'm going to read the 12 verses that are our study this morning, and then we will move quickly through as we see the culmination or a continuation of Matthew's attempt to show his readers that Jesus was the Messiah, the promised Messiah, here on earth as a human, to walk among us, speak among us, to show us his care for us and his desire to provide safety for us for eternity. We call that heaven. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." That's an important word, worship. Verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written." Verse 6, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Verses 9 through 12. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Let's break this passage down, a well-known passage, and see if we can get some additional and new insights, and maybe see why our curriculum writers suggest we study this story this morning as our Christmas lesson, and also maybe see why Matthew gives us this story. Matthew is the only gospel in which this particular story is presented. It's clear enough from the beginning of the second chapter that this story tells of the journey of the Magi, the quest to find the one who was born King of the Jews. Now that tells us that Jesus had already been born and that it's during the time of Herod. They are coached by the king who has consulted with his experts, and they go and visit Bethlehem and do homage or pay homage to the king, to the child. So who are the Magi? The Magi we initially think of as either kings or wise men. Some translations don't use the term Magi, instead use the term wise men. Some refer to kings. We have the Christmas carol, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." And so there is the assumption somewhere that it's three. There are some early Christian traditions that say there would be 12. I didn't get into that deeply, and so I can't expand too much on that. But Magi is in the plural, and so wise men might be a fair translation for those translations that do use that reference. But the idea here is these wise men are searching for the King of the Jews, and they're following the star, and quite possibly they too have read of the Old Testament references and prophecies of a very important king being born in Bethlehem. It says they are from the east. Where from the east, we're not told. Many speculate that that would be Persia or Babylon. And I think it's more interesting to think that they are from Babylonia, from Babylon. Remember, as we have been studying in Ezekiel, the Israelites were carried into captivity and were in exile in Babylonia, in Babylon. And so there would still be a great deal of interest, and there probably would be writings that these wise men could go and research from because of the prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, who wrote during the exile in Babylon. Anyway, they might have been led from their research to go to Israel. They see a star indicating something is that perhaps this star is an omen. They're thought to be astrologers. They were famous for learning and for their wisdom and their study of the stars. And so if they see something out of the ordinary in the heavenly hosts, different terminology there, they might think it was an omen. So what brought them to Jerusalem? Well, the star. And that should tell us, give us a hint, one of the hints, that maybe the most important and significant mover in this whole story is God himself. Now, God is not specifically mentioned here in chapter 2 in Matthew's telling of the visit of the Magi, but his presence is obvious. The star had guided the wise men at least to the area. Bethlehem is a small town. It's located not very far from Jerusalem. When I toured Israel, we went to Bethlehem. We did so by bus. And for some reason, it sticks in my mind that that bus ride was 18 miles. But most of the commentaries say it is much less of a distance, maybe as short a distance as 6 miles. Maybe that's from the edge. Maybe Jerusalem has expanded and we drove from the far side of Jerusalem. I don't know where I got the 18 miles, but Bethlehem is a small town. It is presently one of those towns that control of the town has been ceded to the Palestinians. And it is walled. You have to go through a great barricade and be subject to be searched by the Palestinians before you're allowed to get in. So the star leads them to the area. The research tells them that it's in the area, Bethlehem, if they follow that research. But they go, where would you go if you're looking for a new king who has been born? You would go to the palace. So they go to the palace where Herod is in residence, as in on the throne. And Herod doesn't really know where this king is to be born. He may get the sense now that he turns to the chief priests and the scribes, the learned people of Israel, the learned Jews, and they tell him, and that's what we read out of verse 6, Micah tells us in his chapter 5 that it's Bethlehem. And so the Magi are coming. They have been led by the star, now by God's word. And then after consulting with the palace, with Herod, they follow the star further to a house in Bethlehem. Now, who is this Herod? Herod at this time, we would know Herod to be Herod the Great. He ruled Israel and probably as a puppet ruler from 37 BC to 4 BC. He died in 4 BC. That tells us then that Jesus is born at least in 4 BC and maybe towards the end of 5 BC because Herod is still alive, as this story illustrates to us. Any study of Herod would tell us that he is a ruthless, paranoid tyrant. He murdered 3 of his own sons. He killed his favorite wife. He had 10. He drowned one of the high priests. All of this because of some fear that they might, during different times, be conspiring against him. And so the thought of a king being born, was an immediate threat to this paranoid man, especially if it is the promised Messiah. Now, we need to know also, we ought to know, and so I give it another piece of information. Herod is not a Jew. Some writings say he is a half-Jew, but he is an Idumean, that is an Edomite. He is a descendant of Esau, not of Jacob. He could not be trusted, and he trusted no one, thus giving us a little more understanding of why he tells the wise men, Here's the information. It's in Bethlehem. It's not very far from here. Go find the exact spot and come back to me. Let me know, and I will go worship him. Which, of course, we find from the later verses that it was his intent, and he carried out that intent to kill the newborn king by ordering the death, the killing of every child 2 years of age or younger. That's why he asked the Magi, when did you first see the star? And so to be safe, knowing that they had traveled a great distance, he ordered that every child 2 years of age or younger to be put to death. And that's another part of the story, but it's also included here at the end, where we saw God being involved again in verse 12, which read, I'll read it again, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to the country by another route. Once again, God is the primary mover, even though Matthew doesn't specifically reference God. They go to a house in Bethlehem. Now, our first thought of the Magi visiting Jesus, the newborn Jesus, is the traditional picture and scenes of the wise men, the shepherds, and the animals all gathered around the manger. While in Bethlehem, I purchased a nativity scene made out of olive wood, or carved out of olive wood, or so they tell us, and told me, and brought it and gave it as a gift to Becky. But we know from this story that the nativity scene is just the traditional effort of putting all of the stories of Jesus and Jesus' birth into one picture, because Jesus is no longer in the stable, he's in the house. Now, traditionally, the English word used in Scripture is the inn, like we would think of a motel. But Bethlehem then was a very small town. It still is small. It was so small it would not have an inn or a motel as we think of it these days. And so that word probably is not referring to going up and seeing if you could get a room for the night. People were being ordered by Caesar Augustus. For Caesar Augustus sent out a decree that all the world was to be taxed. And so you went to your land or home of heritage. Joseph and Mary were both of the lineage of David, and so they went to Bethlehem. Other relatives of theirs would have also gone to Bethlehem. And there's probably relatives living in Bethlehem. And so they go to the house of one of their relatives. But it's full of other relatives. So there is no room in the house, in the inn, says the Bible. And they were offered the stable. The house in Bethlehem, the houses, many people lived basically in caves, and in the cave they kept the few animals they had, and then at the front of the cave they built out from the cave and built structures and living quarters. And so there was no room in the house, and so Joseph and Mary, you can stay in the stable. By the time the Magi get here, the taxing season has passed. Everybody else has registered and probably paid their taxes or been counted so they would know the government, and the government is the Roman government, would know where they are and how to tax them and assess taxes. But by now, the other relatives have left, and so there is room in the house, and Mary and Joseph are in the house. That's where the Magi find them. So why didn't Mary and Joseph go home? They have a brand new infant child. and it's not good to travel yet. And so they are still there and still in the house. But the most critical word in the text this morning, is found in two places. There at verse 2, where the Magi say, "We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." Also, in verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. The Magi, these wise men, probably of a priestly caste from Babylon or Persia, they come to worship Jesus. They have gotten confirmation from the star leading them, from the wise men of Israel, and the star taking them literally to the house, that this is not just another king. There must be something divine about this king. Therefore, he is worthy of being worshiped. Worship includes submission, adoration, and homage. They showed their submission by bowing to Mary and the child, their adoration by the gifts they gave, and their homage, again, homage is the giving of high regard, expressions of high regard. This is more than just a king. This is divinity. And thus, it illustrates a part of why Matthew includes this in his gospel and why we still study it in a Sunday school lesson today. Jesus is the Messiah promised by God throughout the Old Testament prophecy, and he has come as a man, as a human. He is an infant at the moment, but he is due our worship. They showered him with gifts, gold, frankincense, or some newer versions say incense, and myrrh. And many Bible commentaries speak of the symbolism of these gifts. Gold is a gift for a king, but in the Old Testament it is also the proper setting for the sanctuary where God dwelt. Incense is for deity, as evidenced in the Old Testament, where the incense is sprinkled on the sacrifices that are given to God himself. Myrrh is a preparation for a funeral. It's not an incense, but it's something that smells good, that masks the smell of death. And so the symbolism is that God's son Jesus, just born, is going to die. Now, let's pause quickly and say there is nothing in Matthew's writings that tells us that these gifts were symbolic in the manner just illustrated. Instead, the best from just a pure reading of Matthew's chapter 2, 1 through 12, is to know that costly gifts are given by the Magi to the family for the child, the newborn king, the Messiah. And we can accept Matthew's gospel to teach us that Jesus is the Messiah. So, what else do we get from today's lesson? What is our meaning? The emphasis is on the coming of the Messiah. The salvation is available even to the Magi, where at the end of Jesus' ministry, at the end of Matthew, what does Matthew say that Jesus told his disciples? He said, "Go into all of the world and make disciples of all nations." Here we see at the beginning of Jesus' life here on this earth, as a human God, as God incarnate in man, we see that the nations, the representatives of foreign nations, have come to him, to recognizing that he is divine. I don't think they know for sure what Messiah is, but even the Gentiles, that is non-Jews, are going to pay homage, give great expressions of great worth and worshipfulness to this one. If the whole world, represented by the Magi, are giving homage to Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, then how can we ignore who he is? How can we, like the man in Paul Harvey's story, disregard and say, I'm not interested in the story of God's Son coming to this earth as a man? How can we not, as that man, also realized God wanted to tell each of us he cared for us. He wanted to and wants to provide for us, and he wants to provide us with safety from the storms of life. How does he do so? He provides his Son, Jesus. And if we place our trust in him, we have an eternity of safety in his presence, in his place. Paradise, heaven. Thank you for joining with us this morning. I wish that you have had a great and wonderful Merry Christmas, and that you pause in all of the fun and exchanges of gifts, which may come from the idea of the Magi, to recognize Jesus is in fact the reason we celebrate this season. Thank you, and Merry Christmas.